Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of the Ozark Mountains. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing what places and what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the dense forests of the Ozark Mountains, where the mist clings to the ancient trees like spectral fingers, there exists a story that has been deliberately erased from most historical records. The year was 1776, a year known for revolution and the birth of a nation. But while the eastern seaboard was embroiled in war, another kind of darkness was unfolding in the remote wilderness of what would later become Missouri and Arkansas. The earliest documented mention of the Pruitt family comes from land registration records in colonial Virginia. Nathaniel Pruitt, born in 1734 to English immigrants, was noted as a skilled carpenter and farmer of modest means. His marriage to Sarah Blackwood in 1756 was recorded in the parish registry of a small church outside Williamsburg. Tax records indicate they lived on a small farm for nearly 2 decades, during which time they had 5 children: Thomas, born 1758, Elizabeth, 1760, Catherine, 1764, Samuel, 1770, and infant Rebecca, 1775. What prompted the family to leave their established home for the dangerous frontier remains subject to speculation. A partial letter discovered in colonial administrative records suggests that Nathaniel had encountered financial difficulties. "The debts grow beyond my means to satisfy them," he wrote to a cousin in early 1775. "I have heard tell of land in the Western Territories, where a man might claim acreage sufficient to establish a legacy for his children." Another fragment from a different letter dated November 1775 hints at another possible motivation. Sarah has not been well since Rebecca's birth. The physician suggests a change of air might improve her constitution. Whatever their reasons, the Pruitt family's westward journey was documented in multiple sources. A merchant's ledger from a trading post in Kentucky recorded their purchase of supplies in February 1776. A military dispatch noted their passage through a frontier fort in March of the same year. By April 1776, they had reached the western slopes of the Ozark Mountains, where Nathaniel filed a land claim with a French colonial administrator for a 200-acre parcel near what is now Jasper County. The official land claim, preserved in territorial records, describes the property as a fertile valley bounded by limestone bluffs to the north, with ample water from a clear running creek, substantial timber, and meadow suitable for cultivation. Nathaniel's signature on this document, compared with his earlier signatures from Virginia records, shows a notable steadiness, suggesting a man confident in his decision despite the perilous nature of frontier settlement. Construction of the Pruitt homestead was documented in the journal of a passing missionary, who noted in June 1776 that he came upon a family newly arrived from Virginia, industriously engaged in the construction of a substantial dwelling. Mr. Pruitt has already erected a fine cabin of hewn logs, larger than most frontier habitations, with separate sleeping quarters for the parents and children, a common room of generous proportion, and a well-constructed root cellar for the storage of provisions. The missionary also noted that the family appeared in good health and spirits, particularly Mrs. Pruitt, who seemed much recovered from an earlier indisposition. This description of Sarah Pruitt's improved health was corroborated by a letter Nathaniel sent to his cousin in Virginia, dated July 1776. "Sarah thrives in the mountain air. Her melancholy has lifted, and she tends the garden with vigor unknown since before Rebecca's birth. The children, too, flourish in this wild country. Thomas assists me in improving our claim, while the girls have established a small schoolroom in a corner of the cabin, where Elizabeth teaches her younger siblings their letters." The letter continues with descriptions of the land that suggest Nathaniel believed he had found the fresh start his family needed. "The soil yields bountifully with little encouragement. We have planted corn and beans, squash and potatoes. The forest provides ample game, and the stream that passes near our door teems with fish. We want for nothing that honest labor cannot provide. These documented accounts paint a picture of the Pruitt family's first months in the Ozarks as a time of optimism and renewal, which makes what followed all the more disturbing. The first indication of trouble comes from a fragment of what appears to be Nathaniel's personal journal, discovered in 1952 by historian Arthur Fleming in the collection of a private antiquities dealer in Philadelphia. The entry, dated September 18, 1776, marks a distinct change in tone from his earlier correspondence. Thomas discovered a peculiar opening in the limestone bluff behind the house today. It appears to be a natural cave entrance, partially obscured by fallen rock. The boy was eager to explore, but something about the darkness beyond the entrance filled me with unease. I forbade him to enter without my accompaniment, though I have no immediate intention of exploring the passage. Sarah says I am being superstitious, but I cannot shake the feeling that some things are best left undisturbed. A subsequent entry, dated September 30th, contains the first mention of what would become a recurring motif in the Pruitt mystery. The sound began 3 nights ago, a low rhythmic pulsing that seems to emanate from the direction of the cave. Sarah cannot hear it, nor can the younger children, but Thomas confessed this morning that it has been keeping him awake. He described it as like a heartbeat, but not quite right. I told him it was merely the wind moving through the rock formations, but I do not believe this myself. The next preserved entry, dated October 12, 1776, indicates an escalation. Thomas's fascination with the cave entrance grows troubling. Twice this week I have found him standing before it at dawn, as if he had been there all night. When questioned, he claims no memory of leaving his bed. Yesterday I found markings scratched into the ground before the entrance, symbols I do not recognize, arranged in a circular pattern. Thomas denies creating them, and indeed, they do not seem like the work of a boy. I have covered them with stones and told the children to keep away from the bluff entirely. By late October, the journal entries suggest the situation was deteriorating rapidly. October 24th, 1776. Elizabeth now speaks of hearing the sounds as well. She describes them differently than Thomas. Voices singing without words, she says. I have caught her watching her brother when she thinks no one observes her. Something passes between them, some understanding I am not privy to. Sarah suggests it is merely the natural alliance of siblings, but I perceive something more troubling in their silent communications. October 27th, 1776. Found Catherine standing before the hearth at midnight, staring into the flames without blinking. When I touched her shoulder, she turned to me with an expression I can only describe as hunger, though not for food. She spoke a sentence in a language unknown to me, her voice deeper than should be possible for a child of 12. When I pressed her about it in the morning, she had no recollection of the event. November 3rd, 1776, the markings have reappeared, not only before the cave entrance, but now etched into the wood of our dwelling, behind furniture, beneath rugs, in the corners of rooms. I have not caught anyone in the act of creating these symbols, yet they multiply daily. Sarah finally admits that something is amiss, but attributes it to some fever or frontier madness. I am not convinced that the explanation is so mundane. The most disturbing entry, dated November 12th, reads, "The sound has returned louder than before. Sarah insists it is merely the wind in the rock formations, but I know better. It comes from beneath. The children hear it too, though they no longer speak of it. Thomas watches the floor at night. Found him sleeping in the root cellar again this morning. Says he hears his name being called." A week later, on November 20th, Nathaniel wrote, "Sarah found marks on the children this morning, like small burns on their shoulders and backs. She accuses me of discipline I did not administer. The marks form patterns I cannot comprehend. Elizabeth can now recite passages of Scripture she has never been taught. When asked how she knows these words, she only smiles. Her teeth seem different somehow. The final entry from the journal, dated December 2nd, 1776, reads simply, "I have found what lies beneath the root cellar. God forgive me for bringing my family to this place. They are in the walls now. They speak with borrowed tongues. I have failed to protect them from what was waiting here long before we arrived. The French trader comes in 5 days. Perhaps there is still time." This last entry aligns with historical records confirming that Jean-Baptiste Duval, a French fur trader, visited the area in early December. His account of what he found at the Pruitt homestead represents the first outside documentation of the incident that would confound researchers for generations. Duval's original ledger, preserved in the collection of the Missouri Historical Society, but sealed from public view until 1968, contained the following entry, dated December 7, 1776. Arrived at the homestead of the Englishman Pruitt near midday. The cabin appeared in good order, with smoke rising from the chimney and no outward sign of distress. Upon approaching, however, I observed an unnatural stillness, no movement within or without, no sound of human activity or animal husbandry. The door stood partially open. Within, I discovered a scene unnatural in its perfection, as if the family had simply turned to vapor while going about their daily tasks. A meal laid upon the table, still warm, 5 places set, though the family numbered 7, garments folded neatly upon chairs, the hearth fire burning low, but not extinguished. Most peculiar was the family Bible laid open upon the table, certain passages in the book of Judges marked with a substance that appeared to be blood. I shall not transcribe the verses here, for they disturb my thoughts even now, though they were familiar texts. I called for the family, searching the sleeping quarters and the surroundings of the cabin, but found no sign of recent human passage. No tracks in the soft earth save my own, though a light snow had fallen the previous night and should have preserved any evidence of departure. I confess I experienced a profound dread, unlike any I have known in 20 years of frontier travel. Though no threat presented itself, I felt observed from all directions, as if the very walls of the cabin held eyes. In the root cellar I discovered, here several lines of text have been deliberately obscured by what appears to be ink. I shall not speak further of what I found there. Some things are best left undocumented, lest they take root in one's dreams. I departed with haste, traveling through the night despite the dangers, so great was my desire to put distance between myself and that place. I shall report the disappearance to the colonial administrator at Fort Charlesworth, though I doubt any action will result, given the remoteness of the location and the present military concerns. A follow-up entry in Duval's ledger, dated December 10th, indicates he did indeed report his findings. The administrator has dispatched 3 militiamen to investigate the Pruitt homestead. I declined to accompany them, despite the offered compensation. No sum would induce me to return to that valley. I provided detailed directions and advised them to exercise extreme caution, particularly regarding the root cellar. I fear my warnings were received with skepticism. Colonial administrative records confirm that 3 militiamen, identified as Corporal James Harlow, Private William Scherer, and Private Thomas Jenkins, were dispatched to investigate the Pruitt homestead on December 12, 1776. No official report of their findings exists in preserved records. More telling is a brief note in the duty roster dated January 20, 1777. Harlow, Scherer, and Jenkins to be listed as deserted, their accounts forfeit. This classification contradicts standard military procedure of the time, which would typically list men who failed to return from an official mission as missing rather than deserted. This discrepancy caught the attention of Claude Fontaine, the colonial administrator who had ordered the investigation. His personal correspondence, discovered during a 1964 archival project at Washington University, included a letter to his superior dated January 25, 1777. I must express grave concern regarding the Pruitt matter. The men dispatched to investigate have not returned, nor has any communication from them been received. This marks the disappearance of an entire family of 7, followed by 3 militiamen sent to determine their fate. I have interviewed the traitor Duval again and found him reluctant to elaborate on his initial report. He exhibits signs of acute distress when pressed for details, particularly regarding what he observed in the root cellar of the homestead. I propose a larger expedition, properly armed, to determine what has occurred. While frontier disappearances are not uncommon, the circumstances, as described by Duval, suggest something beyond the usual dangers of Indian hostility or natural calamity. Furthermore, the proximity of the Pruitt claim to the cave systems known to exist in that region raises additional concerns, given the recent discoveries made by the geological expedition led by Dr. Montrose last summer. No record of a response to Fontaine's letter exists in colonial archives. However, a military dispatch dated February 8, 1777, notes that a patrol of 6 men, led by Lieutenant Burke, investigated reported disturbances near the western limestone formations and found no evidence of recent human habitation or distress. The carefully neutral language of this report, with no specific mention of the Pruitt family or homestead, suggests an intentional obscuring of the purpose and findings of this second expedition. What is clear from subsequent records is that by March 1777, the Pruitt homestead had been destroyed. A land survey conducted in April 1777 makes no mention of a structure on the property, referring to it only as the unclaimed parcel formerly registered to Pruitt, now returned to territorial inventory. This represents a highly unusual administrative action, as frontier land claims typically remained in a family's name for at least 7 years, even in cases of abandonment or death, to allow for claims by relatives or heirs. The systematic erasure of the Pruitt family from official records might have been complete were it not for the persistence of oral traditions in the region. As white settlement of the Ozarks increased in the early 19th century, stories of the family that disappeared became part of local folklore. These accounts often contained elements not found in the fragmentary official records, details that would later find disturbing correlation in suppressed documents. One such oral tradition was recorded by Reverend Silas Whitman, who served as a circuit preacher in the region from 1818 to 1832. In his personal papers, preserved at the Arkansas Historical Society, Whitman documented stories told to him by early settlers. The old-timers speak of a family that came to the valley before the Revolution. They built their home over an old Indian burial site, despite warnings from a local trapper. The father discovered a cave entrance on their property and began to hear voices calling to him from below. The children were the first to change, becoming silent and strange, with eyes that reflected no light. Then the mother took to walking at night, speaking in tongues no Christian had heard before. The father held out longest, but in the end, he too was taken by what lived beneath the earth. When a trader found the homestead, the family was gone, but something wearing their skins remained for a time. The militiamen who went to investigate never returned to the fort. A larger party was sent, and they found the house empty, but for strange markings carved everywhere. They burned the place to cleanse it, but it's said that the ground there remains cursed. Nothing will grow, and animals avoid it. Most disturbing is the claim that sometimes travelers report seeing children playing near the ruins in the twilight. Children with eyes that reflect no light, who invite passers-by to come below and meet the family. Those who follow are never seen again. Whitman noted that he initially dismissed these accounts as frontier superstition, but became troubled by their consistency across settlements that had no apparent connection to each other. I have heard essentially the same narrative with only minor variations from settlers in locations 50 miles apart who claim no knowledge of each other, he wrote. This suggests either an underlying factual basis or a remarkably widespread transmission of folklore in a region not known for easy communication between isolated communities. In 1841, historian William Porter of St. Louis became the first scholar to attempt a comprehensive investigation of the Pruitt incident. His interest was piqued by references to the Pruitt tragedy in correspondence between early territorial administrators. Porter's research notes, partially preserved in the collection of the Missouri Historical Society, document his methodical approach to unraveling the mystery. Having encountered multiple references to the Pruitt incident in the correspondence of Claude Fontaine, I have undertaken to determine the facts of this matter. Initial inquiries with the Territorial Archives yielded little information, with several documents noted in inventory lists mysteriously absent from their expected locations. This pattern of missing documentation is itself noteworthy. I have identified descendants of Jean-Baptiste Duval living near St. Genevieve and hope to determine if any family papers might contain additional information about his encounter with the Pruitt homestead. I have also located church records from the period that may contain information about the family prior to their disappearance. Porter's subsequent notes indicate increasing frustration with official obstacles to his research. My request to examine the sealed portion of the Fontaine correspondence has been denied without explanation. Similarly, military records from Fort Charlesworth for the period in question are reportedly lost. I find it difficult to believe that documentation from multiple sources would be simultaneously unavailable unless some effort has been made to restrict access. More troubling is the reaction I have received from certain officials when making these inquiries. The territorial archivist, upon hearing the name Pruitt, visibly paled and informed me that no such records existed, despite my having seen references in indexes. A retired military officer suggested I would be wise to leave sleeping dogs lie and find another subject for historical research. Despite these obstacles, Porter persisted, turning to unofficial sources such as local folklore, church records, and the private papers of frontier families. His breakthrough came in the form of a journal kept by Elizabeth Carver, wife of a militiaman stationed at Fort Charlesworth in 1777. In an entry dated February 20th of that year, she wrote, "James has returned from the expedition to the Pruitt place much altered. He will not speak of what they found there, but he wakes screaming in the night. He has taken to examining the floor of our cabin and listening at the walls. Yesterday I found him carving strange marks into the support beams, similar to those Dr. Hartford discovered on the body of Jenkins when they brought him back. James claims no memory of doing this. Dr. Hartford confided in me that Jenkins died not from any wound or illness he could identify, but rather as if life simply departed from his body over the course of several days. Before the end, Jenkins spoke repeatedly of those who wait below and the replacement that must occur. James refuses to discuss Jenkins or Shearer, changing the subject whenever they are mentioned. This journal entry represents the first documentation that at least one of the militiamen, Thomas Jenkins, did return from the initial investigation, only to die under mysterious circumstances. It also introduces elements that would become recurring motifs in the Pruitt mystery: those strange markings, the references to those who wait below, and the concept of replacement. Porter's research notes indicate he located and interviewed descendants of James Harlow, the militia corporal listed as deserted, met today with Jacob Harlow, great-grandson of Corporal James Harlow. According to family lore, Harlow did not desert, but returned from his mission in a state of severe mental disturbance. He was confined to an outbuilding on the family farm, after he attempted to lead his children to a cave he had discovered nearby, telling them that the family below wished to meet them. According to Jacob, his ancestor spent his final weeks carving symbols into the walls of his confinement and speaking in multiple voices, including those of children. Before his death, he reportedly told his wife that they look like us, they sound like us, but they are not us. They are patient, so patient. They have always been here, waiting beneath. Jacob claims the outbuilding was burned after Harlow's death. When I inquired whether any record of the symbols remained, he produced a small leather pouch containing a piece of wood approximately 4 inches square, with markings carved into its surface. He permitted me to make a drawing, but refused to part with the artifact, stating that family tradition held that the mark must stay with the blood or misfortune would follow. Porter's drawing of the wooden artifact shows a series of interconnected symbols resembling stylized human figures arranged in a circular pattern around what appears to be a representation of a cave or tunnel entrance. The similarity of these symbols to prehistoric rock art found in certain Ozark cave systems was not noted by Porter, who likely had no knowledge of such archaeological findings, but would be observed by later researchers. The most revealing document uncovered by Porter was a sealed letter from Claude Fontaine to his superior, dated March 10, 1777, which Porter discovered in the personal collection of Fontaine's granddaughter. "I write to you in strictest confidence regarding the matter of the Pruitt homestead and the subsequent investigations. I believe we have done what is necessary in destroying the dwelling and expunging the related documents from official records, but I remain deeply troubled by what we discovered. The testimony of Jenkins before his death, combined with the evidence found at the site, suggests something beyond ordinary human comprehension. The markings found throughout the dwelling match those discovered in the deeper chambers of the cave system behind the homestead, markings that Dr. Montrose's expedition documented last summer and attributed to an ancient indigenous civilization. Most disturbing were the items discovered in the root cellar, which appeared to have been deliberately constructed over a natural shaft leading to the cave system below. The cloth pouches containing human remains of varying antiquity suggest that whatever influence affected the Pruitt family has been present in that location for generations, perhaps centuries. Jenkins spoke of seeing the missing militiamen, Harlow and Shearer, in the caves below the homestead, but claimed they were no longer themselves. His description of their behavior and appearance before his escape matches what the trader Duval reported about the Pruitt children: a perfect stillness, unnatural smiles, and eyes that seem to absorb light rather than reflect it. I believe we have contained the immediate threat by sealing the most accessible cave entrances and removing all record of the Pruitt claim from official documents. However, I cannot shake the conviction that we have merely postponed rather than prevented a recurrence. The limestone formations in that region are riddled with passages, many too narrow for adult human entry, but perhaps navigable by children or smaller individuals. I recommend that no further settlement be permitted within 5 miles of the original Pruitt claim, under the pretext of uncertain land titles or military reservation, if necessary. Furthermore, I suggest that any reports of unusual behavior or disappearances in the broader region be brought to our immediate attention rather than processed through standard administrative channels. What we are dealing with, I fear, is not a singular tragedy, but the discovery of something that has existed alongside human settlement for untold generations, something that waits, watches, and occasionally reaches out to claim those who venture too close to its domain. This letter, with its references to deliberate suppression of information and the sealing of cave entrances, provides the first documented evidence of an official cover-up regarding the Pruitt incident. It also introduces the concept that whatever happened to the family was connected to something ancient that predated their arrival. Porter's final journal entry, dated October 15, 1841, reveals the profound impact his research had on him. I now understand why this matter has been systematically obscured. What occurred in that valley was not merely a tragedy, but something that challenges our understanding of human nature itself. The patterns I have discerned across decades of incidents in that region suggest an influence that persists beyond the original event, manifesting whenever human habitation encroaches upon certain underground spaces. I have decided to abandon this research and destroy my notes. The knowledge I have accumulated feels dangerous, not merely to my academic reputation, but to my fundamental well-being. Since examining the Harlow artifact, I have experienced increasing disturbances in my sleep and moments of dissociation during waking hours. I find myself drawn to the walls of my study, with an inexplicable urge to recreate the symbols I have seen. Most troubling, I have begun to hear sounds emanating from beneath the floorboards of my home, sounds that my wife and servants cannot detect, a rhythmic pulsing like a heartbeat, but somehow wrong. The same sound described by Nathaniel Pruitt in his journal. I believe the authorities were correct in their decision to conceal these events. Some knowledge is too dangerous to preserve. Porter's research materials were reportedly destroyed in a fire at his home the following week. He survived, but never spoke or wrote of the Pruitt family again. When questioned by colleagues, he would reportedly become physically ill and refuse to discuss the matter. He died 3 years later, his once promising academic career abandoned. For nearly 80 years following Porter's investigation, the Pruitt incident remained largely forgotten outside of local folklore. However, beginning in the mid-19th century, a pattern of similar incidents in the same geographic region began to emerge, incidents that would eventually draw renewed scholarly attention to the original mystery. Court records from 1847 describe a family named Collins who settled approximately 10 miles from the original Pruitt homestead. Within months, neighbors reported unusual behavior from the family's 4 children, including prolonged silences, speaking in unison, and standing motionless in their yard for hours, staring at the ground. When local authorities investigated, they found the parents in a catatonic state and walls covered with markings similar to those described in the suppressed colonial reports. The children reportedly told investigators that the people under the floor had instructed them to prepare for the replacement. All 6 family members were committed to an asylum in St. Louis, where they died within a year, having never provided a coherent explanation for what occurred. The attending physician at the asylum, Dr. Frederick Schaefer, kept detailed notes on the Collins family, portions of which were discovered during a 1962 renovation of the former asylum building. The Collins children present a most unusual case of shared delusion or folia familia. All 4, ranging in age from 6 to 13 years, maintain an identical narrative regarding entities they claim exist beneath their former home. They describe these beings as resembling humans, but possessing qualities that mark them as other, eyes that absorb rather than reflect light, movements too fluid to be natural, and voices that seem to bypass the ears and manifest directly in the mind. Most disturbing is their consistent claim that these entities are gradually replacing humans in the region, beginning with isolated families. When asked to elaborate on this process of replacement, the children become agitated and begin carving symbols into any available surface, symbols that bear a striking resemblance to those documented in cases of religious mania, despite the children having no apparent exposure to such materials. The parents remain unresponsive to treatment, exhibiting a profound catatonia interrupted only by periods of glossolalia. During these episodes, they speak in what linguistic experts identify as a mixture of languages, including elements of Osage and other indigenous dialects, interspersed with what appears to be a language unknown to current scholarship. Physical examination reveals unusual markings on all family members, patterns of small, perfectly circular lesions approximately 1/4 inch in diameter, arranged in geometric configurations on the upper back, shoulders, and base of the skull. These lesions do not appear to be the result of any known disease process or physical trauma. Dr. Schaefer's notes end with a troubling observation. I am forced to consider whether the Collins family's condition might result from environmental factors specific to their settlement location rather than purely psychological causes. The geographical proximity to the site of the infamous Pruitt incident of 1776, which I had previously dismissed as frontier mythology, now strikes me as potentially significant. I have written to the Missouri Historical Society requesting access to any documentation of the earlier case for comparative study. No record of a response to Schaefer's inquiry exists, and his subsequent medical publications make no further mention of the Collins case. However, asylum records indicate that following the death of the last Collins family member, Dr. Schaefer took an extended leave of absence, citing health concerns. He never returned to his position, and reportedly relocated to Boston, where he abandoned psychiatric practice in favor of botanical research. Similar cases appeared in records from 1879, 1904, and 1936, all within the same geographic area, all exhibiting the same pattern of behavioral changes, mysterious markings, and references to entities beneath the earth. In each case, official investigations concluded with either commitment of survivors to institutions or determinations of mass suicide or murder-suicide. Alternative explanations were not entertained in official records, despite inconsistencies that troubled investigators. The 1879 case involved a family named Whitaker, who had purchased land approximately 15 miles from the original Pruitt homestead. Church records from the period include a letter from the local pastor to his bishop, expressing concern about the family. The Whitaker children have not attended Sunday school for 3 weeks. Upon visiting the family, I discovered a troubling transformation in their demeanor. These previously lively and inquisitive young people now sit in perfect stillness, speaking only when directly addressed, and then in a manner that seems rehearsed. Mrs. Whitaker appears heavily sedated, though she denies taking any medication. Mr. Whitaker was not present, reportedly engaged in improvements to their root cellar. Most disturbing was my discovery of unusual markings carved into the underside of their furniture and the back of religious paintings, symbols of a kind I have never encountered, certainly not Christian in nature. When I inquired about these markings, the eldest daughter, Mary, aged 12, informed me that those below required them for the preparation. When pressed on what she meant, she smiled in a manner I can only describe as predatory. I fear some unwholesome influence has taken hold of this family and request guidance on how to proceed with pastoral care in this troubling situation. No record of a response from the bishop exists. Local newspaper archives indicate that the Whitaker family home burned to the ground 2 weeks after the date of this letter, reportedly due to a lantern overturned during a family disagreement. The remains of all family members were said to have been recovered and buried in the church cemetery, though cemetery records from the period show no entry for Whitaker burials. The 1904 case is better documented, as it coincided with increased newspaper coverage of rural communities. The Miller family, John, his wife Eleanor, and their 3 children, had relocated from Chicago to a rural property in the Ozarks to establish a self-sufficient farm. 6 months after their arrival, local authorities were called to the property by concerned neighbors who had not seen the family for over a week. The Jefferson County Gazette reported on October 12, 1904, "Family tragedy in remote settlement. Sheriff's deputies made a grim discovery yesterday at the Miller homestead, where all 5 family members were found deceased under bizarre circumstances." According to Sheriff Wilson, the family appeared to have been dead for several days, though no signs of violence or struggle were evident. "It's the strangest case I've encountered in 15 years of law enforcement," Wilson stated. The family was seated at their dining table as if taking a meal, but there was no food present. The positions appeared peaceful, with no indication of distress. Medical examiner Dr. James Harrison has ordered the bodies transported to St. Louis for further examination, as the cause of death could not be determined at the scene. Neighbors reported that the Miller family had become increasingly reclusive in recent months, with the children withdrawn from the local school in September. Of particular note were extensive modifications to the property discovered during the investigation, including an elaborately expanded root cellar with multiple chambers extending into the limestone formation behind the home. Deputies reported unusual markings throughout the dwelling, which Sheriff Wilson declined to describe in detail. A follow-up article a week later reported that the medical examiner had determined the cause of death to be consumption of a poisonous fungal substance, likely mistaken for edible mushrooms, a conclusion that failed to explain why no trace of such substance was found in the home or why the family would have remained seated at the table as the poison took effect. More revealing is a personal letter written by Deputy Samuel Jenkins to his brother, discovered during a 1965 research project on early law enforcement in the Ozarks. I cannot shake the memory of what we found at the Miller place. The official report mentions the family seated at the table, but it doesn't capture the wrongness of the scene. They were too still, arranged too perfectly. And their expressions, not peaceful as the sheriff claimed, but empty, as if something essential had been extracted from them. The markings we found weren't simple graffiti or religious symbols. They covered every surface, walls, ceilings, floors, even carved into the family's furniture and etched onto their silverware, intricate patterns that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. The longer I studied them, the more I felt they were studying me in return. But it was the root cellar that truly disturbs my sleep. The official report mentions modifications, but doesn't explain that the family had excavated a passage extending at least 30 feet into the limestone bluff behind their home. At the terminus of this passage was a vertical shaft descending into darkness. We could not determine its depth, as drop torches were extinguished before reaching bottom. Near this shaft, we discovered a journal belonging to John Miller. The entries from their first months were ordinary accounts of farm establishment, but beginning in August, they took a troubling turn. Miller wrote of hearing sounds emanating from the bluff at night. Voices without words, he called them. He described his children becoming fascinated with the limestone formation, spending hours pressing their ears to the rock face. The final entries document Miller's discovery of the cave entrance and his initial exploration. He described finding evidence of previous habitation of great antiquity and markings identical to those my children have begun drawing without ever having seen them. The last coherent entry, dated October 1st, reads, "They are not speaking to us. They are speaking through us. I fear we have become vessels for something that has waited in darkness for generations." The sheriff ordered the journal burned after reading it. He also commanded us never to speak of the shaft or the markings, instructing the medical examiner to find a plausible natural cause for the deaths. When I questioned this decision, he took me aside and told me that similar cases had occurred in the region before, and that official policy was to prevent panic and preserve property values. I handed in my badge the following week. I cannot serve in an office that conceals truth, particularly when I suspect that concealment may enable future tragedies. I write this account so that some record of what really happened may survive. Deputy Jenkins reportedly left Missouri shortly after his resignation, relocating to Oklahoma. Attempts by later researchers to locate him or his descendants proved unsuccessful. The 1936 case is particularly well documented, as it involved a family named Larson, who had recently relocated from Chicago to a rural property in the Ozarks. The father, Edward Larson, was a journalist who had actually come to the region researching historical disappearances for a book. Neighbors reported that the family's behavior changed dramatically approximately 2 months after they began renovations on their property, renovations that included expanding the home's root cellar. The final police report indicated that Larson killed his wife and 2 children before taking his own life, but responding officers noted inconsistencies they could not explain. The family was found seated at their dining table, deceased, but showing no visible injuries. Autopsy results were sealed by court order and remain unavailable to researchers. Most notable was the statement by the sheriff's deputy, who first entered the home. They were sitting there like they were frozen in time. All of them staring at the same spot on the floor. Their faces didn't look right, like they were stretched somehow. And the markings all over the walls, I don't know what language that was, but it wasn't English. The root cellar door was open. None of us would go down there after what Jenkins saw. What Deputy Jenkins saw was never officially documented. He resigned from the sheriff's department the following week and reportedly left the state. Attempts by researchers to locate him in the 1960s were unsuccessful. The Larson case might have faded into obscurity like the others before it, were it not for a crucial discovery in 1967. During the probate of the estate of Helen Milner, an elderly librarian in Springfield, Missouri, executors discovered a sealed box among her possessions with instructions that it be destroyed upon her death. The executor, Milner's nephew, chose instead to examine the contents, a decision he would later describe as the greatest regret of my life. The box contained what appeared to be Edward Larson's research materials, including extensive notes on the Pruitt family disappearance and subsequent similar cases. How Milner came to possess these materials remains unknown. More disturbing were the journals Larson kept during his residence in the Ozarks, documenting his family's slow transformation. According to these journals, Larson had discovered a network of limestone caves beneath his property that contained evidence of both indigenous and colonial-era activity. Among the artifacts he found was a metal box containing documents he believed belonged to Nathaniel Pruitt, including detailed drawings of symbols and what appeared to be instructions for some kind of ritual. Larson's journal provides the most comprehensive first-hand account of the progression of symptoms associated with what he came to call the replacement. March 15, 1936. We've been in the house 2 weeks now, and I've established my research office in the small bedroom at the back. Marion and the children are settling in well, though they find the isolation challenging after Chicago. I've begun organizing my notes on disappearances in the region, focusing particularly on the Pruitt case. The similarities across incidents separated by decades are striking. Families in isolated settings, behavioral changes in children, references to voices or entities below, and the recurring motif of replacement. March 30, 1936, remarkable discovery today. While excavating to expand the root cellar, I broke through into what appears to be a natural cave system. The opening is narrow but navigable. Initial exploration reveals a chamber approximately 15 feet in diameter with several smaller passages leading deeper. Evidence of previous human activity includes tool marks on the walls and what appear to be very old fire pits. Most intriguing are markings carved into the stone, symbols similar to those described in accounts of the Pruitt incident. April 10, 1936. I've penetrated perhaps 50 yards into the cave system. The passages are complex with many branches and levels. In a chamber approximately 30 feet below the surface, I discovered a metal box of colonial-era manufacture, badly corroded but intact. Inside were papers and a small leather-bound journal that I believe belonged to Nathaniel Pruitt. The handwriting matches the sample I obtained from Virginia records. The journal contains drawings of symbols identical to those carved in the cave walls, along with text that appears to be instructions of some kind, though the purpose is unclear. April 18, 1936. Emily mentioned hearing singing from the walls last night. When I pressed her for details, she described it as voices without words. The description matches accounts from previous cases, almost verbatim, though I have never discussed my research with the children. Michael has become fascinated with the root cellar door, sitting before it for hours. Marion suggests it's merely childhood curiosity about my work there, but I find myself troubled by the intensity of his focus. April 25, 1936. Marion discovered unusual markings on Emily's back this morning, small circular lesions arranged in a geometric pattern. Emily claims no knowledge of how they appeared and reports no discomfort. The pattern matches a symbol from the cave walls. I have not told Marion of this correlation. Michael has begun drawing compulsively, always the same interconnected symbols, identical to those in the Pruitt journal. When asked where he saw these designs, he replies only, "The people under the floor showed me." May 3, 1936. The children have become increasingly synchronized in their movements and speech, often completing each other's sentences or speaking in unison without apparent awareness of doing so. They spend hours in whispered conversation that ceases when adults approach. Marion reports hearing sounds from beneath the floor at night, a rhythmic pulsing she describes as like a heartbeat, but wrong somehow. I have not told her this precisely matches Nathaniel Pruitt's description from 1776. May 12, 1936. I have begun to hear the sounds as well. They are most pronounced near the cave entrance, but seem to permeate the entire house at night. The children now speak of those who wait below and the preparation that must occur. Marion has developed markings similar to Emily's. I have found myself carving symbols into the underside of furniture without conscious intention. The compulsion is difficult to resist. May 20th, 1936. Marion no longer sleeps. She stands at the foot of our bed watching me with an expression I cannot interpret. The children speak to me in voices that are not their own, explaining that what waits beneath has always been here. Long before the first settlers, before the indigenous peoples, they have shown me the markings I must create for the replacement to occur. I understand now why the Pruitt incident was hidden, why all the others were obscured. Such knowledge is too dangerous. May 21, 1936. They are in the house now. I see them moving behind my children's eyes. Marion no longer speaks, only smiles. The children tell me what waits beneath has been patient for centuries, gradually expanding its influence. They speak of other sites, other families, a slow and methodical process of replacement that has continued undetected. I have failed my family. By bringing them here, by pursuing this research, I have delivered them to forces I cannot oppose. I hear them coming up the cellar stairs now. They wear familiar faces, but they are not my family anymore. God forgive me for what I must do. This final entry, dated the day before the family was discovered deceased, represents the most detailed account of the progression of the replacement from initial symptoms to final outcome. Larson's research materials and journals were turned over to local authorities, who promptly transferred them to federal officials. Like so many documents related to these incidents, they were sealed from public view. Milner's nephew, who had read the materials before surrendering them, suffered a nervous breakdown several months later. During his treatment, he repeatedly mentioned the replacement and drew symbols on his walls that reportedly matched those described in Larson's journals. The geographic clustering of these incidents led some researchers to hypothesize a connection to the unique geological features of the Ozark region. The area is known for its extensive limestone cave systems, some of which contain evidence of human activity dating back thousands of years. Indigenous oral traditions speak of certain caves as gateways or boundaries between worlds, places where the membrane between realities grows thin. Archaeological evidence suggests that some cave sites in the region were used for ceremonial purposes by various indigenous cultures long before European settlement. Rock art discovered in remote caverns depicts humanoid figures with distorted features and symbols similar to those described in accounts of the Pruitt incident and subsequent cases. In 1923, anthropologist Margaret Welch conducted research on Ozark folk traditions, recording interviews with elderly residents who shared stories passed down about the family that disappeared. These recordings, housed at Washington University in St. Louis, were restricted from public access until 1967, when portions were released to qualified researchers. In one recording, 94-year-old Joseph Miller recounted what his grandfather had told him. They didn't just vanish, you understand? They were there, and then they weren't, but they left something behind, something that wasn't them anymore, but wore their faces for a time. That's what the old folks said. Anyway, that's why they burned the place down. Fire cleanses. Another elderly resident, Martha Crowley, spoke of a journal kept by her great-grandmother, which contained a second-hand account of the incident. The children were found first, all sitting at the table like they was waiting for supper. But they'd been sitting there 3 days, according to the men who found them, just sitting, not talking, not moving. Their ma and pa were nowhere. When they tried to get the young ones to speak, they just smiled. They didn't eat, didn't drink, and their eyes weren't right. These oral histories introduce a crucial element not explicitly stated in official records. The claim that the Pruitt children were found alive but fundamentally changed, unresponsive, refusing food and water, yet somehow surviving for days before they were taken to a church in a neighboring settlement. What happened after their arrival at the church varies in different accounts, but all versions end with the burning of the building under mysterious circumstances. No official record of this church fire exists in colonial documents. The most compelling theory about the Pruitt mystery was proposed by anthropologist Catherine Reynolds in a controversial 1965 paper that was rejected for publication. Reynolds hypothesized that the Pruitt family inadvertently settled above a site of ceremonial significance to indigenous cultures, possibly one associated with altered states of consciousness or communal ritual. The combination of geological features, potential environmental contaminants such as fungal spores common in cave systems, and the psychological stresses of frontier isolation could explain the pattern of psychological deterioration observed in these cases, Reynolds wrote. Indigenous knowledge of these effects may be reflected in traditional warnings about certain cave systems being doorways to other worlds or realms of non-human entities. Reynolds suggested that the symptoms described across multiple cases, auditory hallucinations, compulsive creation of symbols, synchronization of behavior, and the sensation of being influenced or possessed by external entities were consistent with exposure to certain environmental toxins, particularly fungal spores known to have psychoactive properties. The limestone cave systems of the Ozarks create ideal conditions for certain fungal species that produce compounds similar to ergot alkaloids, which have been linked to historical cases of mass psychosis. What made Reynolds's theory particularly compelling was her discovery of a 1947 geological survey that identified unusual mineral deposits in cave systems near the presumed location of the Pruitt homestead. Deposits containing elevated levels of arsenic, mercury, and other elements, known to cause neurological symptoms when exposure occurs over time. The persistence of similar symptoms across centuries suggests a constant environmental factor rather than a transmissible pathogen or cultural phenomenon, she argued. The combination of psychoactive fungal compounds and low-level heavy metal exposure could produce the exact constellation of symptoms described in these cases, Reynolds concluded. The progression from auditory hallucinations to visual phenomena, to behavioral changes, and ultimately to catatonia, or death, follows a predictable neurotoxicological pattern. Reynolds's attempt to secure funding for a comprehensive study of the area was denied. Like many before her, Reynolds eventually abandoned her research after reporting disturbing dreams and the sensation of being watched. Her academic career suffered following her persistence in pursuing the Pruitt mystery, and she eventually left anthropology entirely, relocating to Arizona to work as a high school teacher. The last documented incident that fits the pattern established by the Pruitt case occurred in 1952 when a family of 4 disappeared from their recently purchased farmhouse approximately 15 miles from the original Pruitt homestead. The case received little attention at the time, attributed to abandonment after the discovery that the property sat above an unstable cave system. No bodies were ever found, and the property has remained unoccupied since. What makes this final case particularly notable was the background of the family patriarch, Dr. Richard Conley, a geologist specializing in karst formations who had come to the Ozarks specifically to study the region's cave systems. Conley's academic publications prior to his disappearance include several papers on unusual mineral formations found in limestone caves and their potential effects on groundwater. In his final published paper, dated January 1952, Conley wrote, "Certain cave systems in the western Ozark region exhibit mineral compositions unlike any documented elsewhere in North America. Of particular interest are deposits containing compounds that, when subjected to the specific temperature and humidity conditions common to these environments, may release airborne particulates with potential neurological effects." Historical accounts of unusual psychological phenomena associated with these cave systems may have a basis in these environmental exposures rather than in the supernatural explanations often attributed to them. 3 months after this publication, Conley purchased property near the site of the original Pruitt homestead and relocated his family there to conduct on-site research. No further academic publications appeared under his name. When authorities investigated the family's disappearance in June 1952, they found the home intact but unoccupied, with a meal laid out on the table, a scene eerily reminiscent of the original Pruitt incident. More disturbing was the discovery of Conley's field journal, which documented his exploration of a cave system accessible through the property's root cellar. The final entries describe his discovery of unusual growth patterns in fungal formations near mineral deposits and his decision to collect samples for analysis. He noted that his children had begun exhibiting heightened sensory awareness after accompanying him on several expeditions into the caves, including the ability to navigate perfectly in total darkness and communicate without speaking. The final entry, dated June 3, 1952, reads simply, "They have always been here." Not a contamination, but a communion. The children understand already. Susan is beginning to accept. I am the last to comprehend what we are becoming. The replacement is not an end, but a transformation. County records indicate that following this incident, a local historical preservation society purchased a large tract of land encompassing both this property and the presumed location of the original Pruitt homestead. The stated purpose was environmental conservation, but no development or research has been permitted in the area since. Attempts by journalists and researchers to access these locations have been consistently denied. In 1959, the last known descendant of one of the 3 militiamen who vanished while investigating the original Pruitt homestead granted an interview to a local historian. The elderly woman shared a family story passed down through generations, that her ancestor had not disappeared but had returned, changed, speaking of the family beneath and the replacement that must occur. According to family lore, he was confined to an outbuilding on the family farm, where he inscribed symbols on the walls and spoke in voices not his own until his death 3 weeks later. Before he died, he reportedly told his wife, "They look like us, they sound like us, but they are not us, and they are patient, so patient. They have always been here, waiting beneath. The Pruitts were just the beginning." This statement, consistent across multiple independent accounts separated by decades, suggests a continuity of experience that transcends explanation as mere folklore or coincidence. It points to something persistent in that region, something that waits, watches, and occasionally reaches out to claim those who venture too close to its domain. In 1968, during renovation of the county courthouse in Jasper County, Missouri, workers discovered a sealed compartment within a wall containing a metal box. Inside was a collection of documents dating back to the late 18th century, including what appeared to be a partial official report regarding the Pruitt incident. The report, written by a French colonial official, described findings at the homestead that contradicted the narrative of disappearance. According to this document, physical evidence suggested the family had engaged in unusual behavior in the weeks leading up to the incident. The walls of the cabin had been inscribed with markings hidden behind furniture and hangings. Beneath the floorboards, investigators found small cloth pouches containing human teeth, hair, and bone fragments, some of which appeared to predate the Pruitt family's arrival by decades, suggesting they had discovered these items on the property. Most disturbing was the description of the root cellar. The document stated that excavation revealed the cellar had been deliberately constructed above what appeared to be a natural limestone cave entrance. The cave itself showed evidence of much older human habitation, with markings similar to those found in the cabin etched into the stone walls. The colonial officials' report concluded that the Pruitt family had not vanished, but rather had fled the area after awakening something that had long slumbered beneath their dwelling. This document was transferred to the Missouri Historical Society, but was restricted from public view by a federal order in 1969. The official reason given was historical preservation concerns, but researchers who sought access were denied without further explanation. In that same year, 1968, anthropologist Robert Chambers led an archaeological excavation in the vicinity of the presumed location of the Pruitt homestead. The expedition's field notes indicate they discovered the charred foundation of a large cabin and evidence of a root cellar that had been filled in with stones. Attempts to excavate the cellar were abandoned after 3 members of the team reported experiencing extreme psychological distress, including vivid nightmares and auditory hallucinations. Chambers' final report was remarkably restrained given these circumstances, noting only that the site appears to have cultural significance beyond its colonial-era occupation, with evidence suggesting prior indigenous use of a complex of natural caves beneath the homestead location. Further investigation is not recommended due to structural instability. What Chambers didn't include in his official report, but confided to a colleague in correspondence, later discovered among his personal effects after his death in 1976, was more troubling. The dreams began after we uncovered the entrance to the cave system. All was the same. Children sitting around a table, silent, watching. Behind them, something moves in the darkness, something that has been waiting. The local workers refused to continue after Thomas discovered the markings. They match what was described in the 1777 report exactly, though we hadn't disclosed those details to the team. How could they have known what to carve into the support beams? And the children's voices at night, calling from the darkness, calling our names. The excavation was officially terminated due to budgetary constraints. The site was backfilled, and no marker was placed to indicate its historical significance. Chambers never returned to the field of archaeology, taking a teaching position at a small college and avoiding further research related to colonial settlements in the Ozarks. In 1973, folklorist Ellen Rutledge began collecting stories from the descendants of early settlers in the region. Her research uncovered a persistent motif in local legends. The Pruitt warning, a set of indicators said to presage a recurrence of whatever happened to the original family. These warnings included unnatural silence in the forest, children conversing with unseen entities, the appearance of unusual burn-like markings on the skin, and the compulsion to create or replicate certain symbols. According to the oral traditions she recorded, certain precautions could prevent the replacement if taken early enough. Never build a dwelling with a root cellar near limestone formations. If children begin speaking in unison or show unusual interest in the ground, relocate immediately. Burn any objects marked with the symbols. Never touch them directly. If family members develop small circular marks on their skin, separation must be immediate and complete. These folk warnings passed down through generations suggest a cultural memory of actual events rather than purely imaginative supernatural tales. Rutledge's work is particularly valuable for documenting the evolution of regional folklore surrounding the Pruitt incident and similar cases. The specificity of the described symptoms and their consistency across accounts from different families and time periods point to a shared experiential basis. What gives the Pruitt mystery its lasting power is not merely the horror of what befell one family, but the implication that it represents merely one instance of an ongoing process, a process that continues beneath the surface of documented history, claiming isolated families across generations while remaining just beyond the reach of formal investigation. The pattern of official suppression is itself a crucial aspect of the mystery. From the burning of the original homestead to the sealing of documents, from the career consequences faced by those who pursued the truth to the psychological toll reported by researchers, a clear pattern emerges of institutional resistance to any comprehensive investigation. This pattern of suppression raises troubling questions. If these cases were merely frontier tragedies, the results of isolation, mental illness, or environmental factors, why the extraordinary efforts to obscure them from historical record? What knowledge was deemed too dangerous to preserve? And, perhaps most disturbing, if the pattern has truly ended, why maintain the secrecy after so many decades? In the dense forests of the Ozark Mountains, where mist clings to ancient trees like spectral fingers, the truth about the Pruitt family waits, a truth systematically erased from history, yet persistent in whispers, in fragments of text, in the inexplicable fear that descends upon those who delve too deeply into this mystery. The land that once belonged to the Pruitt family has remained largely untouched. Hikers and hunters avoid the area, speaking of unusual silence, of the sense of being watched. Local guides refuse to lead groups there, citing dangerous sinkholes and unstable cave systems. Government maps of the region show curious blank spaces where detailed topographical information should be. And sometimes, according to local residents who still pass down the warnings, children go missing in those woods. They return days later, physically unharmed but quieter, somehow different. They speak of playing with other children beneath the earth, of adults with stretched smiles who taught them songs without words. They draw symbols on their bedroom walls and listen to the floors at night. The replacement, it seems, continues slowly, patiently, one person at a time. The doorway that the Pruitt family inadvertently opened remains ajar, and what waits beneath the Ozark Hills continues its gradual emergence into our world. Perhaps the true horror of the Pruitt mystery is not what happened to one family in 1776, but what began with them, a process still unfolding in silence and darkness, beneath the weight of systematic suppression and institutional denial. A process that may even now be reaching its culmination. The truth remains buried in sealed documents, in collapsed caves, in the minds of those who glimpsed the pattern and chose silence over madness. But patterns once established tend to perpetuate themselves, and some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again. In the dense forests of the Ozark Mountains, where mist clings to ancient trees like spectral fingers, something waits, something that wears familiar faces and speaks with borrowed voices, something that has been patient for centuries, and it is still hungry.